You're listening to the Good Food CFO podcast, where we challenge the status quo of the food industry, celebrate good food founders who are building businesses on their own terms, introduce industry disruptors, and are redefining equitability. If you're ready to build your financial confidence and join the good food revolution to change the way the food industry does business, you are in the right place. I'm the Good Food CFO and your host, Sarah Delavan. Today on the podcast, we've invited individuals from throughout the food industry for a discussion about the true cost of food. This is a live recording, which means Good Food CFO Plus members have joined us and will be able to comment and ask questions during the episode. The true cost of food is something that I think about a lot and something that I grapple with. We know that 99% of animals raised for meat, dairy, and eggs are raised on factory farms where working conditions and pay are known to be the worst across industries, and where the earth and the soil are stripped of their nutrients and value. We know that certain crops and animal production are subsidized by the government and sell in retail stores at artificially low prices, despite the fact that prices on grocery shelves continue to rise. When we look at the US Census, it shows us that at least 6% of the population here in the US, approximately 18 million people, live in areas with low income and very low access to grocery stores and fresh food. As good food founders and those in the industry who support and work daily to create a food system that is based on fair wages for all members of the supply chain, who consider their impact on the environment, who center transparency and work to deliver real good food to as many homes as possible, we know that it only works, that good food businesses can only continue and survive if the price of food is based on the true cost and if the consumer can pay for it. Recently, Fruit Queen, a NorCal-based business that sources fruit from local farms they love and delivers it to homes with notes about the fruit and the farms and the farmers who grow it, shared the following in their Instagram stories. They said, individual consumer choices can be a great way for those with the means and privilege to vote with their dollars to demonstrate the way of an alternative to the prevailing paradigm of an unjust and unhealthy food system. But wide-reaching change will also take sweeping policy reform to undo centuries of agricultural, immigration, and civil rights policy built on the exploitation of people and the environment. I believe that that is true, but I also agree with what Ashley Turner said during the On Hunger and Climate panel for the Wall Street Journal Food Conference. She said, business drives policy. We in this generation are certainly not starting the good food movement, but I do believe that we're in a place and in a position to have meaningful conversation across the industry to build the businesses and the relationships that will revolutionize the way that food business is done and truly push this good food movement forward. We will not have all of the answers today in this podcast episode. That is never the goal. Instead, we're here in hopes of creating a better understanding of the roles that people play and that businesses play throughout the industry, and to craft constructive conversations that inspire new ways of thinking and new ways of doing business. It was important to me to bring a farmer, a producer, store owners, and buyers to this conversation to represent several links in the supply chain in hopes of having a well-rounded conversation and a valuable conversation about how we can continue the work of getting good food to more people and changing the way our industry does business. I have had at least one conversation with each of our guests about the true cost of food, some of them on this podcast, and each has a unique opinion and point of view based on their current industry role and past experiences. And each time I'm in one of these conversations, I say to myself, we've got to have a bigger conversation about this. And I'm so proud to say that we're doing that today. I want to welcome rancher Tyler Dolly of Big Bluff Ranch. He first joined me for episode 67 of the podcast to discuss how he raises his chickens, the channels he sells them through, how his ranch differs from large-scale commercial factory chicken farms, the true cost of raising his chickens, and how that affects the price to consumers, as well as what he aspires to build the farm into in the future. We're also welcoming Good Food founder, producer, and retail store owner, Leah Farazani, founder of Semolina Pasta. Leah and I have had many conversations about the cost of doing business when you want to source quality ingredients, support other small businesses, and pay a living wage to your employees. She knows firsthand the reality of having your product price increase on the shelf without a word from the retailer or the distributor, the effects of increasing labor costs due to outside factors like inflation, rising food costs, rents, etc. Much like Tyler, she offers a superior product at a price point that represents the true cost of food, and that is a higher price product than many in her category. Eve Cohen, founder of Marcellus Foods and former buyer, brings a unique perspective to the conversation. She has worked for startups like Good Eggs and retail giants like Walmart, which presented stark differences and realities in the cost of food across industries. Today, Eve is trying to alleviate the stress around finding time and making time to cook meals at home. And last but certainly not least, we welcome Vincent Fanazzo, founder of River Wards Produce. Vincent joined me for a podcast during episode 68, where we discussed the origins of River Wards produce markets, the way in which he's redefining equitability within his company, his approach to sourcing and stocking his store shelves to provide a balanced selection for his customers, how the size of his business affects the cost of food from his distributors and to his customers, and how centering community is a big part of his success. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today.
Hi, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Tyler and Eve, I want to start with you, and specifically you, Tyler. Can you talk a little bit about the differences between your ranch and a chicken farm that receives subsidies?
Yeah, so it's a huge murky mess to really dig into the depths of subsidies and who gets paid what for why and who gets it and where it enters into the stream. So I might get, I'm not going to get into the details because I'd get it wrong, but generally speaking, the government heavily subsidizes corn and soy production. And that means that, the big chicken producers of the world have the ability to buy artificially cheapened corn and soy. The prices, it's just not the true cost of production.
Right.
So they're getting there. And if you're growing a chicken, the majority of your cost in a chicken is the feed that goes into them. So if these big companies can buy corn and soy for a cost that's less than the true cost of production, and that's just the economic cost, that's not even accounting for bad, management practices, over pesticides, over fertilized, dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico, topsoil eroding, all that sort of stuff. That's an externality that no one really accounts for. But if those big companies can buy their feed cheaply, they can sell their chicken cheaply.
Yeah.
And so, and then they also have these huge economies of scale where they buy train loads of corn at once, which is apparently 100 railroad cars is a train, right? And so they're buying multiples of these, right?
Wow.
I think maybe in my 15-year career of raising chickens, I've gone through maybe half a train load, probably not even that much. So you just kind of get the sense that they have cheap inputs and they have huge economies of scale. And so that just means that we come in with our wholesale price is multiple times higher than their retail price.
Right.
And that's just because we do things the right way and we're small. So we're kind of stuck with that situation.
for me, like hearing this as sort of part one of this conversation is just like the starting point of an imbalance in terms of the inputs of product, right? And corn and soy, like we know that soy is in, if like even if we went into like the world of packaged food, right, which fills the majority of our grocery stores, processed foods, there's soy in all of that. There's corn in most of that. It's easy for us to say that the price of chicken is different, right, between your farm and a subsidized farm, but then it expands into other products like, Leah's products don't have corn in them, but if she's competing against a lower quality flour, right, like it travels through the industry.
Well, and the economies of scale that he's talking about, they exist for any good food brand. And then, I think you said that you're farming here in California. And so we're automatically as producers in a state like California, we are automatically at a disadvantage compared to producers in other places in the country, because our land is more expensive, our labor costs are more expensive, our rent is more expensive. There's just so many things in there that if you want to do good business in your community, that I might be able to do the same thing with the same values for less if I didn't live here.
Right.
But then I'm not supporting my community. I'm not supporting people who work and live near where I am. And so I'm making decisions that are wholly on a financial level, instead of the big picture that when you're making food and trying to feed people and doing great work to try and restore soils and do things well, that you're already hamstrung before you left the building.
Yeah. Well, I think is interesting too is like the true cost of food, and I talked about this in the intro. It's not just about the inputs. Obviously, this is a huge factor, and it's wildly impactful, right? Massively impactful. But aside from the ingredients, the cost of people, the cost of land, as you're saying, like all of those things are inputs. And I think on the consumer side of things, and hopefully this type of conversation, finds its way to the consumers as well. Like they don't understand that. And it falls on us to have to educate, people about why pasta and chickens that are produced in one part of the country will have a different cost than say those produced in Pennsylvania, right? I mean, I remember when I was sourcing chicken for a food business in Maine, we went to PA for regional chicken because of their ability to get chicken feed at a much lower price, their ability to have chickens like being raised longer throughout the year. Vincent, I see you shaking your head. Do you want to add something?
No, I was just agreeing with you on the idea of, I hear what Tyler's saying about cheap feed, cheap products, and that's what everyone is looking for when they get to the grocery store, is they're looking at price tags. And it takes a lot of motivation and education to get people to understand that the quality of a product that's produced sustainably, it tastes so much better. And you're going to win people over with taste. Always. We're humans, and our tastes and emotions lead every decision that we make. And so, when you produce a good quality product and you can get it into the hands of the people who want to enjoy it, I think that's how you start to change and convert people to like understanding. Because Tyler, I deal with it all the time. I sell whole chickens that are organic and local, and they're like $35 a chicken. And some people are like, Costco sells rotisserie chickens for $5. What do you, And I'm like, and I know they do, and they're great. But like, those chickens, they also lose money on every single one, and they're not grown the best, and you don't know who grows them. So, it's pick and choose your battles.
And that everything that everyone just said is so much for a consumer to wrap their head around, right? Because I think throughout my career, I've noticed that most people don't understand that feed is the number one cost to raise a chicken, right? Like, to actually be able to talk to someone and be like, okay, A chicken is a living being that, is born, and then it has to eat, and it has to eat to gain weight, and it gains weight so that it's, 3.5 pounds when you put it in your oven. And so for a person who, I've worked with a lot of meat producers and I've worked with a lot of vegans, and sometimes people are very squeamish about really thinking about what the life cycle of a food product that is coming from an animal actually is. But to understand those details of like, okay, we have to go back to the chicken and how long did it live? How much food did it eat over the course of its life? And that's going to be the biggest determining factor of the price. Like, that's super confusing for people. And I think a lot of people don't want to necessarily check in with that. I think a lot of people don't necessarily have the full context to be able to check in with that. And to be at the point, especially as a retailer, where you could actually have that conversation, like that can be really challenging, right? Like then, if you're not the one on the floor talking to everyone who has a question about that, everyone on your team has to be well-versed in how that chicken was raised. And as somebody who I've spent the majority of my retail career in digital, there's an even larger barrier there to being able to communicate what these input costs actually are and, how they affect different products. Because it's kind of easy to wrap your head around like, oh, wheat goes into pasta, because like maybe somebody's made pasta at home, but like most people have not raised a chicken.
I think that's totally true. And I think the even bigger leap then becomes all of those costs that don't actually have dollars and cents that can easily be line itemed for somebody. Because you're talking about things with broad impact, right? The environmental impact of your cheaply made and cheaply grown chicken is a lot greater and has a much longer round of repercussions. Same goes for produce, same goes for pasta. Like all these things have numbers that we can't even begin to fathom because they percolate across the system and become like really big economic impact numbers that are hard to like then distill down to, right, the food that you eat when you choose to buy meat from a CAFO, the waste and the environmental degradation that happens there, and then the water pollution and like how that affects the whole economy of a community. And it just like it spirals out of control, and getting that across to consumers that financial cost isn't even just the ingredients, it just continues.
Yeah, but I think that like highlights a major issue that good food businesses face is there's a limited part of the number of the population who can afford to pay the true cost of food, right? And I'm thinking about when I grew up, right? My mom was like, yeah, I'd love to, buy the best, and I'm going to buy the best that I can afford. But it wasn't Tyler's chicken back then. You know what I mean? There's a lot of people have to just buy the best, do the best they can with what they have. And I think it's the battle is much more difficult because of the inequities in the industry, within the food industry itself. And that's the problem we're not going to solve today. But I think it's just worth bringing back up again. How do we find the people who do have the dollars to vote with the food that they're purchasing? And simultaneously, how do we continue to educate people on the impacts that you guys are talking about now?
Well, I don't know about all the other people on here, but as a producer, and Sarah, you know this very well, like the cost of communicating that to a customer is really, really high. Mm-hmm. And, Eve, you were kind of just referring to like that education that needs to happen when you do have higher quality and higher value things. And how do we as small businesses with tiny little marketing budgets make that dent in sharing all of those things in distilled ways that would help people put their money where their mouths are, to be able to make the difference so that we get some of those economies of scale and could make our food. I'm sure all of us here would wish we could make our food more affordable. That like, we're not trying to sell it as expensively as we do because we want to make boatloads of money. We're doing what we're doing, making nothing and trying to feed people something better.
Yeah.
The big guys get to play with the margin and numbers and balance sheets and revenue and all that sort of fun stuff. But as small people, it really comes down to relationships and education, that it's only when someone can shake the hand of their farmer that the true value comes through. You know, the cost to value ratio. Yeah, my chicken costs a lot of money. It's delicious. It's totally worth it. But, you know, just on the face, if you're just going number to number, there's no sense to ever try our chicken. You're just like, it makes no sense. But if we can enter a relationship with this consumer or with this wholesaler or this retailer and be like, hey, this is everything we're about. We're about regenerative agriculture, certified organic, blah, 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 blah. And you layer on all these values, and then you can, you know, create that understanding. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, now I get why that chicken's more expensive. And maybe I don't buy it every single day, but at least I now understand the value that's in that chicken. And then, you know, it can kind of move forward. And I think this is kind of the beginning of the good food revolution, is that, you know, you got to get the committed minority, right? You got to get them to understand, and then you get them buying more, then it kind of just trickles down. And not to monologue too much here, but this kind of a little bit reminds me of what happened on grass-fed beef, that we started off doing grass-fed beef, and around 99, 2000, there was grass-fed beef was this very fringe movement. Like, it just wasn't really around. And so now we're in what, 2023. So in 23 years, we were just driving home from the Bay Area, and grocery outlet in South San Francisco had a billboard that said, I can't remember exactly, but it was basically grocery outlet was advertising grass-fed beef is best for whatever reason. And so the point is that the industry that the initial adopters of grass-fed beef brought in, the second wave and third wave and the fourth wave, now grass-fed beef, yeah, it's been watered down. There's issues with it, but it's gotten to the point now where you can find grass-fed beef in grocery outlet. And I think you can't help but say that's a step forward in the right direction.
I think that's a really good point. I have some challenges with the idea of like things trickling down from wealthy consumers to consumers who maybe have less money to spend on food, mainly because I think like there's a lot of work to do. And Sarah, I've been thinking about something that you said at the opening about how business drives policy. And it brought up for me something that I've been grappling with a ton, because I'm based in Utah now. I'm from California originally, and we've been trying to launch our business here. And there's very little, if any, government support for food and agriculture in the state of Utah. It's not a super agricultural state, really hard to grow things here. It's a desert. And I was talking to someone from the Department of Ag, and she told me that they had been requesting funds from the legislature through the USDA, because it goes through the state legislature and then into the Department of Ag, so they can allocate it out to producers. And she said that she's been told multiple times by the legislature that if private companies and private investors are not investing in food and ag, why should the government? Which is like shocking thing to hear. But I think what it really drove home for me, this idea that business does drive policy, right? Like they're looking for, you know, smart investment decisions. And I think you see something similar in the adoption of grass-fed beef or the growth in organic, right? Like there's a lot of people who are really touting, like last year was like the highest sales of organic produce ever. And we've seen that growth. But I think, you know, a lot of that organic produce is imported from China, and a lot of the true producers are not seeing that value. And so where does the policy need to come in to start offsetting some of the infrastructure costs, some of the input costs, and some of the development to help small scale businesses or, you know, independent producers try to make products that are more accessible for a broader number of people, right? Because if we're thinking about, who's really driven a lot of that growth in organic, it's probably Walmart at the end of the day. And they benefit from a tremendous number of policies. I had the opportunity to have a conversation with the CEO of Walmart when I was there, because I am an insane person who sent him an email complaining about something he was doing. And he called me on my desk phone 2 minutes after I had sent the email, which was like, I don't even know, he's like Batman or something. But he told me, hey, I have to go to the White House because if I don't have a good relationship with the president, like that puts my entire business at risk, and that's my job. And so if we think about, all of the things that are at play here, like really business is driving a lot of that policy. And it, I think, can't be solely up to individual relationships with consumers or with buyers to make more space for folks who are really doing a good job.
Well, I do think, though, that it also then is incumbent upon us as business owners to reframe what it means to be successful business, right? And I think that's what a lot of us are struggling to figure out how that works, because I've had all sorts of visions and versions of my business in my head, and Sarah's been privy to probably half of them, but a lot of it is incumbent upon finding investors and people that are business minded, that don't see growth in food as needing to grow in the way that tech businesses do. The modern business mindset is 10x returns in 5 years, and then everybody cashes out. Well, how do you build a sustainable food system based on those values?
You don't. It doesn't work.
You can't.
It's trying to make it work.
There's no way.
Down to making the most money in the shortest amount of time. And then you're going to have to exploit everything possible to make that happen. And I think that unless, as business owners, that we are able to find successful ways to operate that don't require us to sacrifice all of our values for short-term gains, that I don't know how we make those decisions. I totally agree with everything you said, Eve. And I've always had a hard time with the idea of like, the only way that my pasta will become more affordable is if I just sell more pasta so that I can get some economies of scale and lower the price and blah, blah, blah. It just never freaking happens. It won't. There's no version of my business that exists that will happen. It will always be expensive unless I sell to Kraft or to Ronzoni or whoever the hell owns them, whatever it is. But you know what I mean? And then it won't be good food anymore. It'll be the same garbage that everybody else gets.
I was just going to say, it's like what I'm kind of hearing is this idea that like, in order to succeed, we have to get big so that we can compete with these other big players. And then if we get big, if we get to a certain size, are we still who we set out to be? Are we still achieving the things that we want to? And I want the answer to be yes, but where does the money come from? And how much money does it take to get over the hump to where there's financial ease? That's part of why internally we always say we want to change the way that food business is done. Like, how do we as a community of good food founders and good food industry supporters go, stop, enough? Like, we are not going to say yes to this. We're not going to. There's a different path forward. I don't know what that looks like. I talk about, transparent conversations, right? Like saying to maybe not a Walmart right away, but certainly a Kroger or even a Whole Foods and saying, or a Sprouts and saying, this model doesn't work for me, but here's what does. What are the immediate things we can do just for our own businesses to say, nope, this doesn't work for me. Here's what does. And if they can't agree to it, we find a different way to grow. But I think the risk of that is that we stay smaller than we want to, and we continue to suffer the financial difficulties of being a certain size food business.
I mean, I think if you gathered every founder that tried to put together a food business with great values that failed, and they all were able to outline all of the reasons why they failed, like I think a lot of us would have the same things in common, and it wouldn't be for lack of trying. It wouldn't be, sometimes it wouldn't be for lack of funding. It wouldn't be for lack of, care about quality or supply chain. I think that the game is just not set up, and we're not vocal enough about it. We're not
Yeah.
vocal enough about the inequities that exist. Consumers have to think differently, producers have to think differently, and retailers, that like everybody has to think differently. And that's a huge mind shift. And it feels like, the beauty of the conversations you start is the more opportunities we have to get that out there, the better. But I think that sometimes it does feel like the average person has no idea how hard it is to get food on their plate.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to say, Eve, you mentioned before last year, the top seller of organics was Kroger. Kroger is trying to buy Albertsons. Their main goal in buying Albertsons is to get close to Target and Walmart in their purchasing power. Those four companies control close to 60 to 70% of all distribution in the country, and they have this monopoly. And right now there is legislation that I've voiced my support for and been a part of some organizing that is, there's antitrust laws that are being broken, because I can't even, if for a commodity, something that we've seen everywhere, you could say like Chobani yogurt, right? I can't even buy it wholesale. I could buy 4 pallets of it. I can't even buy it cheaper than what they sell it for. It's impossible. I don't have access to it. It's gate kept by their volume and the pressure that these big box retailers put on these suppliers, even though these suppliers are huge. Chobani is like owned by Dana now or something wild, but we are already at a disadvantage with price. And customers to education, they come in and Tyler chicken, you're not going to find anywhere, and Leah, your pasta company, that's beautiful on the shelf in the boxes, but they're going to be like, how come this is $1.75 more here than at Whole Foods or than at Kroger? And you're like, sorry. Like, there is no response. And so I think, voicing it louder, credit card fees are just something that we just accept, 2%, sometimes 3%. If you're smaller, Square right out the gate for a farmer's market, people pay 3%. Those, Walmart pays 1% or less in credit card fee transactions. And the UK capped credit card fee transactions at 0.25%. The small guy is how everyone makes their money. That's how UNFI makes their money, and KeHE and all these guys. They make it off of us. They don't make it off of Target. And it gets hard.
Yeah.
I think the one of the other things that we didn't touch on that I would love to, I had a conversation with another producer yesterday who was recently asked to go through a GMP audit, which was something that I was confronted with having to do last year, and some of the regulatory hurdles that smaller producers have to take and the expense to be asked to participate in programs for food safety when we are, we're all doing things to keep ourselves making things food safe that are impossible for smaller producers to adhere to. I was telling this producer that if they had to, for their small manufacturing plant to be able to prepare themselves for a GMP audit with what I knew that they had in place, they needed to have $10,000 to $15,000 on hand just to get going. And that they should really make sure that the account that is requiring them to do that was going to be worth spending that money, because it was money that they wouldn't recoup. And the decisions that they're making as a producer are like, well, then does that mean I have to go to a co-packer? because if I want to take on a client of that size and I need those like I need to jump through those regulatory hurdles, like what's the mechanism to say like my business at its size might have a food safety plan that should be pared down or supported, right? Like if you want me to be FSMA compliant and FSMA has layers and layers and layers of regulation and the requirement of one person sitting and doing QA for 8 hours a day when, and I have a low risk product, thank goodness. And I do a lot of things to like maintain those things, but to have that person on, I don't have $80,000 to pay somebody a year to do those things. Like, how do I break through that? Well, my alternatives, if I want the account that requires me to have GMP, is to go to a co-packer, and then there's not right-sized versions of programs either, whether it's with bigger retailers or whether it's food regulatory agencies and things. And I think that that's something else that could be addressed to help improve good food, right? The logistical hurdles of being certified organic. I have one ingredient. Like, I don't even know how anybody does anything then when they have like 30 things that they have to trace. So you're having to trace all of your inputs into your soil and your feed and all your, right? Like how to ensure that people who are trying to enter into the system have the support that they need to make those best practices decisions without them bankrupting them as well, because they can't afford to hire the person to stand around and check logs all day.
Yeah, my mind goes to policy, right? Thinking about you, Tyler, and, when it comes to animals and processing animals and the different restrictions and regulations on what can be processed where. And, a lot of farmers I know in California drive hours to go and get their animals, processed, because that's the one place that they can go and do it. And it's a huge cost in transportation fees, in human time, right? In the actual cost of processing the product, in lead times and wait times. Maybe you can speak to it a little bit more, Tyler, but I think, we've been fighting for different models and different modes of processing in the state of California for as long as I've been here. And I don't know that they've made any progress, for small farmers. Can you speak to that a bit?
If anyone ever asked me if they want to go in to become a meat producer, I'm like, well, first the answer is no, you probably don't. And then the second answer is figure out before anything else, who is going to process your meat. That it's in California, you have maybe 5 to 10 would be the absolute max red meat processors where you could get your small scale beef production processed. If you're doing poultry like I'm doing, you have 2 options. That's it. In all of California, there's 2 places that do custom chicken processing. And, chickens only travel so many hours before things don't work out so well for them. So that means people down in the Southern California really can't stand up a chicken industry or pasture poultry industry down there. There's not very good processing options. So ultimately, the bottleneck, the choke point on increasing local meat production in California and most all across the US is processing capacity. That you have the producers, there's plenty of people who are willing to spend time playing with animals. There's a reasonable amount of money, a number of people willing to eat those animals. But the processing link is kind of a hidden issue that, yes, there's some stuff going on, but ultimately it's the biggest impediment to growing small scale. And so, if you want to become a meat producer, that's fantastic. Figure out who's going to process your animals for you, because it's probably going to be much harder than you think. Like, for instance, my chickens, I have chickens going to harvest tomorrow night. I scheduled them 12 months ago.
And I would just add, so, we consider Marcellus Foods not just a retailer, but also a processor. And so it's a conversation that we're involved in across the board with other categories as well. And the same thing, Leah, that you brought up, we're sitting right in between this conversation on the meat side and on the produce and other product side, because what most larger purchasers for small to mid-scale farmers require is some sort of processing, some sort of value add. And that just doesn't exist. Or they require heavy certification, food safety certifications. And so we're in a conversation with a whole network of producers, mainly in Yolo County, who are stuck between basically farmers markets and institutional purchasing. And there's a lot of interest. There is policy, there is government funding that's interested in increasing institutional purchasing for local and regional products, but there isn't the comprehensive support or the right size buyer to be that stepping stone between, right? And so that's what we really see is an advantage that we can bring to a regional food system, is that ability to say, hey, we don't need you to have everything. We're going to take your raw produce, your rice, your grains. We're going to cook it in essentially commissary kitchens and then sell that direct to consumer as a value added product. And we think that means that we can come in, we don't have to be as big as, a hospital chain or something and be able to buy that much volume, but we can provide that stepping stone. And that should be a turning point. And the meat processing thing is outrageous. Every time anybody talks about certification, I just think about how every custom plant has to have a USDA officer on site all the time. And you have to build them a bathroom. And so
so crazy.
It's wild.
Yeah, the consolidation of the meatpacking industry, but the consolidation among lots of different kinds of processors is a major contributing factor to the position that we're in today. Wow. I've been trying for years to be making pasta with regeneratively grown wheat, and I know farmers. I have relationships with people who will grow it, but the organic mills, there's 3 left in the country that mill semolina, and the smallest one they'll do a day is 50,000 pounds. And you're talking about a farmer with 5 acres, they're out of luck. And there is no infrastructure to mill something that would be of a quality that I would want to use from a farmer that's producing a very small quantity. And so you're leaving all of those people out of the cold. I would pay that farmer more money for their product because I can pass it along in the price, because I can at least have the ability to communicate that real cost of food. You're talking about Utah and the desert, and you could be changing environmental impacts for growing and raising animals down in the Imperial Valley, all those kinds of things. But we've allowed so few people to have the middle ground that they also put a crush on any progress that we can make.
Yeah, the conversation has to include infrastructure, but the thing that I keep finding, my experience has been you were talking, Leah, earlier about how everybody compares growth to software. They also compare cost to build and get started to software, right? all you need is a garage full of engineers and you can make $10 million a year, but that is not what it takes to build a plant to process wheat or to build,
And those are long-term costs, right? To build an abattoir is a long-term cost.
Exactly.
Especially when you talk about all of those regulatory impacts and having somebody who's PCQI certified and a USDA inspector and a blah, 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 blah. And then, so you're looking at any small plant getting off the ground, you're looking at millions and millions of dollars that you probably won't ever see a return on investment on. And that doesn't feel like a good investment to people who are used to making fast money.
Yeah.
If you go and you make yourself a small local processing plant, you still aren't big enough to compete with the big guys, that your
Yeah.
costs are still multiple times
yeah.
more than IBP back in Colorado. So there's no economic, dollars and cents to invest that millions of dollars in a local processing plant because you don't make any money. The local plant built 3 or 4 years ago, I just heard that they shut down here recently because they were great. We actually had some beef processed them with this spring. Great job, great company to work for. Out of business. So I don't know who's going to process my beef next year.
I wanted to add really quickly that the USDA, Ashley Sutterfield, who's been on the podcast a couple of times and has a background in meat production and processing actually, but she's now working with different states and things, helping to create sort of that middle ground, help to set up co-packers. But one of the things she's bringing to the table and to the podcast is a conversation about USDA funding and grants that are going to be released, I believe, in August across all 50 states, specifically for co-packing facilities. So not necessarily milling and processing, but co-packing. It's a direct result of what happened during COVID and the fact that transportation and infrastructure was just absolutely shut down. But I think this conversation today will carry over into my conversation with her, surrounding, is it enough? And how do these businesses stay afloat long term? It's one thing to get a bit of money to set up the infrastructure, but how do you get the food safety certifications and things that you need to be able to process for people on a scale that has enough impact? How big does your facility need to be, right, in order to compete? And I think these are all very valid questions that I'm going to bring to that conversation. So
Yeah,
thank you for that.
There's layers and layers of priorities that need to be worked in, right? If we continue to subsidize soy and corn, then and that's what our priority is, is cheap feed or ethanol or whatever it is, and not a sustainable food system that is, I think COVID's a really good point, Sarah, right? Like there were a lot of disruptions to the food system, and we were really fortunate that, most people kept being able to get food.
Yeah.
But in a food system that's so bifurcated between big players and so centralized and so small about operators at the top, that I think it really depends on how many different participants on policy and business can sit there and say, like, maybe we have to go back 100 years and rethink from the ground up, in how we get food to people. And, I think small retailers are an important part of that. Small distributors and processors are a part of it. Small growers, small producers, like regional food systems. The way that it works doesn't work for very many people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I want to say, like, you participate and you play the game that exists, or you make your own. And that's where I think it comes into the current food industry and how we have to participate. Either we follow the same set of rules, then Leah, you got to get a wholesale account and sell 3,000 boxes of pasta at a loss to increase your volume, right? So you can get that 50,000 pounds of semolina flour. But if you just fuck it all and you circumvent the whole system, right? And if you figure out a way to connect directly with your customers and don't pay slotting fees and don't worry about that, you're able to have more of a connection. And when people know a story, and this goes back to the very beginning of this podcast when we talked about marketing, if people know who you are and how much you care, they will spend the money. But it just is so much more work, and you might not get super rich off of it, but you'll be able to sustain yourself with a beautiful small format pasta company.
I mean, I'm almost
But
10
if you're
years in. Tell me when that happens.
Well, I think what you're saying, Vincent, is it's a model that, I mean, Leah and I literally had this conversation the other day. It's like, do we play the game or do we reel it in and go, nope, we are regional and we create our community and we sell to the community, and can we make the math work for, to make sense? Because there's still that size element.
Yeah.
But it needs to work.
5 years ago, I moved to what I called the big enough model. Right. I was on a rocket ship to the moon with UNFI and realized I was going to go bankrupt really fast and pulled out of that and focused on being big enough to sustain myself. And then COVID hit. And all of a sudden, growth that I had not been going for just came my way because you couldn't get imported pastos. Like, I was the only thing on the shelf. And it made a huge difference. And so we started growing the business based on where we were at. And it's been eye-opening. That the big enough model may have been where I should have stayed. Anyway, the point is like, I hear you and I believe in regional food systems. It's not always enough.
I'm really hopeful for the USDA involvement. I think there are a lot of like really brilliant people there working to solve some of these problems. I think like grant funding alone probably won't do it. It's going to take a lot of money to rebuild the infrastructure that, similar to how, Henry Ford ripped out all the public transportation so people would buy more cars. Like, it's going to take a lot of work to rebuild the type of infrastructure that will allow for that future where you can make a great living having a small to mid-sized regional food business. But I'm really hopeful that we are on that track. And that's really like, I think the more positive and the more, people can get access to that type of funding and the more communities that come together and recognize the value of the type of work that everyone here is doing, I'm really hopeful that that is a future that we can build and that will be the one that's kind of resilient enough to meet the challenges of what's happening in the climate.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you all for coming today. I know that we can all stay here for a long time and continue this conversation, but we do, we have businesses to run, right? Like those little things. I'm so grateful for the time that you guys have spent here and the insights that you have shared, because I think a big part of creating change is also having these conversations, sharing the difficulties, sharing the realities, exposing the gaps, the holes, the missing infrastructure in what we're doing, as well as sharing possibilities, right? And new ideas and ways of doing things that don't follow the norm, that don't follow the centralized system, and being a part of the industry that is sort of the current model that a lot of food brands and businesses try to fit into. So I think everything that each of you shared today is going to be extremely valuable for the listeners of the podcast. And I invite you, if you're able to hang out inside the community as a member, and be available for folks who have questions, or just to be a continued part of this conversation in any way that you may be able to. And maybe we'll get together again and continue this. And I think for sure we'll invite others into this conversation and have it grow. And eventually it'll get formalized. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I'm sure there'll be something formal in the future that really starts to drive real change. So thank you for being a part of this at this point. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Nice meeting all of you.
So nice to meet you.
Nice meeting everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Jesse.
Have a great day, guys.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
For more content and connection with good food founders and industry experts, join us inside the Good Food CFO community. Visit thegoodfoodcfo.com/join to learn more. Thank you, as always, for spending time with us here today. If you enjoyed this episode or found it helpful or inspiring in any way, Please share your thoughts with your founder friends and on social, and rate and review the podcast wherever you listen. That's the #1 way to help more good food founders find the show. I'll be back with a brand new episode in 2 weeks.